Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alejandra Gonzalez. I'm the head of international affairs at Universidad de La Sabana. And on behalf of the Cross-Sector Board for Science Diplomacy in Colombia, MIDIC for its initials in Spanish, the DAD, Universidad de La Sabana, and Fundación Universitaria Juan N, it is our great pleasure to welcome you to the last lecture in our series, Communication for Science Diplomacy. Today, we are delighted to hear from Dr. Tim Flink, who will share insights from his many years of professional experience on the topic, how does science communication work within the framework of science diplomacy and in the German Bundestag. But before I introduce our wonderful guest and his topic in more detail, allow me to take a few minutes to provide you, for the sake of context, a few considerations about the broader theme, communicating for science diplomacy, and how the idea for this series came about. So in recent years, science diplomacy has become an increasingly important concept for science policymaking and international cooperation. Both in Colombia and globally. Colombia has built a strong foundation in this field with the Cross-Sector Board for Science Diplomacy in Colombia playing a key role. MIDIC is a collaborative platform that brings together more than 50 institutions, including universities, higher education institutions, research centers, ministries, and international partners, with the goal of promoting science as a driver of public policy and international collaboration. Among the key aspects about the MIDIC are that it is a bottom-up approach. It aims at maintaining an ongoing support from government representatives to enable this cross-sector dialogue. Its mission is to develop capacity, provide a platform to bring science closer to international political dialogues, and to foster collaboration among key actors for the country's science diplomacy, such as academia, the scientific diaspora, research centers, and many more. In September 2024, MIDIC, the DAD regional office in Bogotá, and Universidad del Bosque co-hosted a workshop titled Science Diplomacy in Practice. This event brought together more than 90 participants from Colombia and international experts to discuss how science diplomacy can be applied in daily university and policy work. You can check the results, which are available in our virtual guide. I think Katarina will share the link with you so that you can access them. And yeah, you can see them now on the screen. And during this workshop, it became clear that science communication is a key area where many institutions and researchers see a strong need for practical support. And that makes sense. Science communication lies at the very heart of science diplomacy. But how do we communicate scientific knowledge beyond the science community itself? How can we effectively reach different non-scientific target audiences? How should we, for instance, communicate scientific facts to political decision makers? And how should we, on the other hand, address society in general or specific local communities? Also, what strategies and techniques are required to make this specific communication work? That's why, in addition to an in-person workshop with 26 participants that we will soon hold in Bogotá, we've also launched this short series of online lectures to address these questions and to open up the conversation on science communication to a wider audience in Latin America. So this series is jointly organized by MIDIC, Universidad de La Sabana, Fundación Universitaria Juan N in collaboration with the DAD. It is part of the DAD's DS, so Dialogue on Innovative Higher Education Strategies program, which is supported by the German Rectors Conference, HIACA, with funding from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. One thing we have unveiled through our numerous discussions on dialogues with national and international partners are the challenges and sometimes the misconceptions surrounding the ideal of science diplomacy, and how important it is to always use a critical lens to understand the goals and practical uses of science diplomacy. For this reason, we are especially pleased to welcome Dr. Tim Flink, as the speaker for this last lecture. Dr. Tim Flink has an extensive background in research and advisory work in the field of science policy, with a special focus on science diplomacy. Among other roles, Dr. Flink served as a scientific advisor in the German Parliament, Bundestag, and currently works as manager of research and innovation policy at the Association of Research-Based Pharmaceutical Companies. He also participates in various international committees that address the intersection of science, policy, and society. I personally learned about Dr. Flink's work through his involvement in the Horizon 2020 project called S4D4C, which, if you don't know yet, I strongly encourage you to learn more about. In this virtual conference, Dr. Flink will provide a detailed overview of the role of science communication in the context of science diplomacy within the German Parliament. Just a heads up, you can listen to the lecture in the original language, English, or you can switch to the Spanish translation channel. To do so, open the language menu in the bottom left corner of your screen. So, parte baja a la izquierda, ahí van a encontrar el botón del idioma. There, you can choose your preferred language channel and adjust the volume balance between the original audio and the translation. The presentation is scheduled to last around 30 minutes, so we'll have some time for questions at the end. You're very welcome to write your questions in the chat at any time. And now I give a warm welcome to Dr. Tim Flink. Dr. Flink, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Before I speak in this lecture, I try to share my screen because I've prepared some slides. I don't know if you can see them. Is it visible?
Yes, we can see them now.
Okay, well, thank you very much again for the nice introduction, the invitation to participate in this workshop lecture. You've well introduced the framework, which is science communication, science diplomacy, and politics, in this case, German politics. And it's a puzzle how they actually relate to one another. Especially the first two ones, so science communication and science diplomacy. We could actually wonder if they're not the same things or concepts, and we'll see how that goes. But first of all, let's have a look at this picture. We see, in this case, a man. I'm sorry, I was gender biased, or I was desperate to find pictures facing a world or many worlds, and probably this is part of the challenges, because we are in a very dynamic world. It's an unstable world. Many things actually happen at the same time. Some things are probably, well, giving us headaches or making us wonder how we can actually survive. And some of the challenges, that's what I'd like to talk, is something that both science communication, science diplomacy, the whole realm of science and higher education is facing, but it's also an issue that society and politics is affected by. And if we look at what kind of challenges we actually face, there's numerous ones, and probably the list of bubbles that I pinpoint here on the slide can be furthered by further challenges, and probably in the next minutes of discussion we might find further. But these are challenges that not only science and higher education, academia, so to speak, face, but it's challenges that the whole of society is actually facing. So on the bottom or on the top left corner, we have transnational and cross-border challenges that affect us all. Climate change is probably the best image that we can see, but COVID-19 actually showed us that diseases do not know borders, and I think we could come up with a couple of other challenges, and these require that, well, they require surveillance, first of all. They require solutions, but not simple ones, complex solutions that we need to take on board actors from different spheres of society, and they require advice. Mobility is a big issue, and migration. They do not only affect us in the academic system, but they affect the whole of society. Demographic change, for example, is a big issue in Germany. Just to give you a rough number, at the moment in Germany, we have about, or roughly 50 million people that we would call workers. And within the next 5 years, almost 10% of these workers will retire. And that's a big number actually for a macroeconomic powerhouse such as Germany within Europe and the world. Diplomacy, I think, is a big issue, but we all know that multilateralism and transatlantic relations are under stress at the moment. There is a new bloc building around the so-called BRIC states, and that puts a lot of the world under stress. It affects also trade policies. It not only affects security policies. And here again, science is part of it, because it has to do with security technologies and dual use technologies, but science is also affected by these transnational relations that are under stress. We could ramble on with this, but maybe one aspect that is crucial at the moment, I think, is populism. So the world, as we've dreamed it, to become more liberal, democratic, is actually going the other way, into the other direction. So less democratic states, less freedom of speech and expression, less free media, less free science, is something that should make us worry within the academic system, but also in society and politics. And then not least, when I was young, we had the idea that there is science, that there is technological development, or we could call it basic research, followed by applied research. Then there might be development, prototyping, and market diffusion. And nowadays we can see that key technologies is something that comprises, a nucleus where science plays a more relevant role immediately. So these segmented steps, which we call linear model of innovation, are actually comprised, and they are decisive for key industries and the fate of macroeconomic policies worldwide. So the ones who have these key technologies will dominate markets, and that's where science plays an ever more important role. So whenever we talk about science communication, we have a double edge or double role. Science is not only observing these developments, but it's an integral part of these developments, if it wants that or not, but its actors have to deal with the fact. And by the way, if I say science, I mean science in the continental European manner, so it comprises all academic faculties, including humanities and social sciences. The question is, how does science diplomacy fit in? And Alejandra, you nicely introduced the topic. As you can see in this very small graph, before the millennial years, nobody talked about science diplomacy. In our analysis, we found 3 scientific references in the Web of Science, in Scopus, in other literatures that had the saying or explicitly referred to the concept of science diplomacy, or that put science and diplomacy as words together. People talked about international research policy or mobility or higher education. And it might not tell much because we know that the DAAD and other organizations did what they did, and there were science attaches around the world. But there's a shift in the public discourse that international science, technology, innovation, and higher education matter to international relations, and vice versa, that international affairs, diplomacy, so to speak, matter for the wheeling and dealing of international science, technology, innovation, and higher education. And that might sound trivial, but in the conception of actors, it was not as present as it is nowadays. And maybe there's an inflation of the concept. That's one of my critical contributions to this discourse. But nevertheless, it has much to do with the fact that we are living in a global world, in the global village, and that science, technology, and innovation matter most at the moment. That hype, so to speak, that inflation of the concept didn't come from nowhere, but it had to do, and on one hand, with the fact that the United States governments, so Bill Clinton followed by Obama, whenever Democratic governments were about to seize presidency, try to resurrect a hard power image by alluding to things like science and higher education as soft power elements that they could use for influencing, civil societies worldwide. But so we had a couple of references, as I said, after the millennial years, with the AAAS and other actors alluding to this positive image of science, cross-border exchange, a non-political sharing of ideas, cooperation and competition on a fair, sportive basis. But I think the first conceptual ideas were carved by the Royal Society and the AAAS's seminal report, New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, in 2010, where they laid out, clarified the different dimensions that I've just referred to, or we could call them means to ends relations. So the first one might sound trivial, diplomacy for science, which means that state governments and public actors like the German Academic Exchange Service, research funding bodies, so to speak, they actually facilitate, logistically, that science collaborations can follow. Otherwise, you couldn't actually do it. So in other lectures, I depict, for example, an example where somebody was trying to hatch coral reefs in Thailand, and he was fined with an outrageous number of currency he had to pay. And the other picture depicts actually a naval diver who's doing maritime research. And before he could do that, actually, and drill coral reefs in Thailand, which are highly secured, so to speak, as a cultural heritage, there has to be a memorandum of understanding between states. And whenever you do research on the ground somewhere else and use facilities, there's something invisible that had happened before, and that is science diplomacy at the core business between foreign ministries, research ministries, science funding. This is actually the grease on the wheel, so to speak, to make it happen. The other one is, as the other dimension, the second dimension, is something that we could just and only call scientific advice to foreign policy making. And that refers to what I've just said, you know, the world's complex, problems and challenges, they don't know borders, and you need to have scientific intelligence to advise on policymakers, be it in the legislative branches or in the executive branches of governments and other entities. And I think the importance has risen over the last years. The third one is a slightly problematic one, to be honest, because it alludes to the image that science is part of civil society. And whenever scientists collaborate across borders, it might have an impact on, you know, the different states' collaboration and images to one another. So it's the classical soft power ideal. But we will see in the following slides that, you know, there are bricks on the wall that, you know, have fallen out due to the fact that the world is in a dire condition. And here science, you know, is in a problematic and challenging situation. Anyway, these are the essential dimensions or definitions. When we did research on science diplomacy, so we did research on 2 times, in 2008 towards 2010, and as a repetition 8 years later, we compared how states go about science diplomacy, and we find there are 3 action patterns, so to speak. So I think what is most important is that states need to get access for their scientists, their researchers on the ground, but they also need to get access to capital and innovative markets to sell their products. So I'm working, as I said, for the Association of 46 research-based companies in the pharmaceutical sector, and these operate globally. And therefore, they're very innovation-driven. They try to find the best opportunities, you know, where to invest into R&D, where to ripe or, you know, reap the fruits of these innovation, sell products, to be very blunt, you know, so sell highly innovative medical treatments on the ground and make sure that people can actually afford them. So this is the access part. And within the framework of science diplomacy discourse, very often we tend to forget that it's about economic competition and not only about, you know, a Woodstock festival where people cherish their collaboration, and but it's about hard interests for states, and that tallies with the second dimension or action pattern. It's about promoting a country's achievement and showing, you know, that it's worth to collaborate with a country X, Y, Z, that they have interesting R&D infrastructures, talents, and that it's a stable environment, so to speak, where scientific knowledge production can, you know, prosper. The third one is an action pattern that we do not see as much in continental European countries vis-a-vis US American or Anglo-American influenced countries, which is influencing by illusion of the images, that the positive images that we have when we think about science. And I think The third one, influence, has gone back a little bit. So it's a very problematic category, because ultimately actors within the science and higher education system always need to think whether they want to be instrumentalized by particularistic interest of politics as pseudo or ersatz diplomats. So in some cases, this might sound trivial. If I'm thinking about Germany, it's a liberal democratic country. I would have no problem in actually showcasing my country. But God knows what happens in 10 years if our right-wing extremist populist party would run into government, whether I would wave the flag, abroad or not be ashamed. And I think in other countries, the discussion of what role science plays and how it should actually set boundaries vis-a-vis policy or tailor its interest that's a very intense discussion as well. If we quickly run through, the mainstream instruments of science diplomacy, we see attaches and counselors networks. So this is a state-driven, policy. Embassies somewhere in the world have these people. So these are proper and formal diplomats. In some cases, people like DAAD staff or, from research organizations, funding bodies are also put into the pocket because they somehow fulfill diplomatic functions, but very often they act independently, or at least so they think. The agreements is something I've already talked about, so as a matter of timing, I skip that. I think it is trivial as well that without money, we cannot do these international scientific exchange programs by multilateral funding infrastructures. Some of them are very large and international or transnational undertakings. Events is also trivial, but we should not underestimate, the function of meeting somebody, exchanging on the ground, getting to know people, and keep up conversations throughout series of events such as conferences and the like. When we did field work, we also got to know the various dimensions of track 2 diplomacy. So when Russia attacked Ukraine and unleashed that gruesome war, there was, in the time when I served in Parliament, an intense discussion among us and the members of German research funding bodies whether to pack in, fold in, and go back to Germany, or to stay on the ground, at least keep contact with a civil society in Russia, for example, that is not okay with its regime's politics. In some cases, 15 years ago, we also got to know science diplomats that were emitted in different countries to actually do what we would call, frankly, espionage. So observing, what's going on in the hot fields of STEM-related research and development. So also this could be called track 2 diplomacy in the name of science diplomacy. But I think everybody is getting the point, and science advice mechanisms can reach from very ad hoc, incremental, played by ear advice of people who come to Parliament or who come to the foreign offices and offer their advice on specific topics, maybe as a single shot game, or it could reach towards permanent and institutionalized positions, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, where you have chief science advisors or mechanisms installed in government, and there's a whole continuum of commissioned research, independent research that should inform policy making. Anyway, when we talk now about the relation between science communication and science diplomacy, the recent report by the Royal Society and the IIES, which is an update of the new Frontiers report I just referred to, came out just this year, last year. There is, so to speak, a tendency to think that we've overdone and, that we overreacted in the public discourse. And that's quite interesting, because these two countries who were providers of this public discourse now come to realize that they've probably done too much, and that whenever we talk about something that is international and something that is scientific or academic, we could say, oh yeah, this is science diplomacy. So any sort of international meeting, between academics is now glorified as science diplomacy, and well, can I get a hallelujah, and now we've seen that new realism is kicking in. Not everything on the ground might be called science diplomacy, but it has to do with proper diplomatic relations. And that's quite interesting, because the European Union, just at the same day of that report, came out with its own report. So in this one, the US, American, and British one, they try to reduce the 3 dimensions towards 2 dimensions. There's science for diplomacy and diplomacy for science. So they skip the advice part and the soft power part, so to speak. And the EU report, I left it out because I'm talking too much anyway. They put a 4th dimension, which is science in diplomacy, or no, yeah, diplomacy in science, excuse me for this mistake, saying that whenever researchers on the international ground talk to each other, whenever they do peer reviewing, whenever they compare results, whenever they try to find common ground, common epistemic ground, there is the risk that things become immediately political and riskful. So if one party has research results of interest and the other party is critical about them, if one party is coming up with a joint research program scheme and the other party is joining forces, and you have some sort of power asymmetries, things can become immediately political, and it backfalls, so to speak, on the relations. So there's, if you will, the recommendation that scientists or academic researchers and research managers should be trained to be more diplomatic, to be more sensitive to these political dimensions. And that's quite interesting in these two fields, so to speak. So the US-American way of thinking and the continental European or EU thinking. Now, if we look at what the German political branch, the legislative branch, the German Bundestag, is actually making of science diplomacy, my experience over the last years before I changed to the pharmaceutical industry is that everything relates to the war that Russia unleashed to Ukraine. We had a famous speech by our German Chancellor, the so-called Zeitenwende speech, so a transition of time, so to speak, a new framework that tries to fully grapple with, a bold, violent world, and that is trying to learn the hard way that the world is a realist place and not an idealistic place. And that has to do with a couple of things, not only related to the war in Ukraine, but Zeitenwende in Germany actually affects a lot of things. So as I said in the introductory remarks, we are increasingly talking about security, research security. We are talking about dual use technologies. We are talking about being affected by espionage whenever STEM related research is affected. So any research that has dual use components or that could be used for stabilizing not only the security, but also the macroeconomic security and stability of autocratic states and regimes. And that was so that the first and security strategy that Germany ever adopted after the Second World War has one entire chapter only related to science, technology, and innovation. You see a parliamentary proposal that I was the main author of, that we got through, and it's called, I translate it to you, an interest and value-based internationalization of science and higher education. And it has to do with the fact that, I skipped the slide, we are talking increasingly about the challenges of getting free science, a science that is safe and secure, but also that is responsible for its actions. And that's a big challenge because on one hand, we have a constitutionally guaranteed freedom in science for German researchers. So whenever you do science or teaching in higher education, you can basically do whatever you want. It's constitutionally protected. At the same time, as I said, this country is falling prey or has fallen prey to threats, hybrid threats from abroad, espionage, disinformation, cyber attacks, and what have you. And thirdly, it's scientists, enjoying all of this freedom that they have are actually demanded by our policymakers to act responsibly. So no, it's not a no-brainer at the moment to do research with China as much as you wanted it. Institutional cooperations and project funding with Russia has been freezed. I could go on with a couple of other countries, and it's not so easy for researchers from other countries to enter Germany and to conduct research in STEM-related subjects. This is the new reality that we have to face, and this is what actually makes science diplomacy and science communication a battleground at the moment. It's not easy to say things, as you could do, and it's not easy to collaborate with everyone as much as you wanted it before. The second one is, yes, we are still trying to find policies and institutions where science, technology, and innovation intelligence is actually being heard. The problem in the parliament and also in the government is that it is segmented in different pockets. So we have a research committee, we have a committee for environment, we have a committee for security, we have a committee for what have you. And all of them pride themselves to being science-informed or to give science-informed policy decisions. But it's very hard to find common ground, actually, and to find, so to speak, a chief science advisory mechanism vis-a-vis people like me nowadays, who are lobbyists, and you have much more resources to enter parliament and politics. So this is a big challenge at the moment, especially due to the fact that challenges, as I said, are more complex than they used to be, or at least so people think and have been made aware of it. The third one is, and that's also a repetition, Germany has always segmented science, technology, and innovation from industrial policy. So we are living in a science, technology, and innovation-driven world, and that makes a discourse different from the last decades. We are talking about money for value discourse now. We are talking about the utility of science, technology, and innovation, and what it means to international relations. And that moves us to a different playing field. And it's a challenge for policymakers who always used to say, okay, what is science diplomacy? It's funding the DAAD and it's funding the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We have two ministries, or maybe sometimes three, so the foreign secretary, the research ministry, and maybe also the Ministry for Development. But nowadays, things also affect the economic ministry. It also affects our Ministry of Security. It's all about selling technology, and it's trying to find the best conditions for researchers to come to work in Germany, to even out our demographic change, and get industry actually still working and investing into Germany. And that's a very different debate. But to do so, you need skilled workers. Again, this might affect, debates about how to deal with the global south. Are we the next brain drainers, or do we still stick to the belief that, it's all about brain circulations and people come and go anyway? So these are the current challenges that we face. And I think I need to stop here, because otherwise we don't have time for discussion. So thank you very much again for having me, and I hope we can enter into different discussion now. I'm all yours, and I will stop my presentation now, maybe to see also someone in the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flink. I think this was such an interesting lecture, presentation. I have so many questions. I don't want to dominate. We're still waiting for participants to send us their questions, but I'm going to take the lead in asking you a couple of things that just came to me as you were presenting, in particular, when you were presenting sort of like the new frameworks of science diplomacy from the side of, US Anglo-Saxon perspective, and then the EU framework, which was, I think, fascinating. You provided me with an idea that I didn't have in mind after, at least a fast reading of both reports. So you mentioned the concept new realism, in the sense that we should sort of be aware of how we're using science diplomacy, and that we shouldn't be using it for anything related to international science. And what kept me thinking was that, okay, if we don't use it for everything, if we should always consider to have this diplomatic politics side of the spectrum, can we say this is sort of like science diplomacy going back to track one diplomacy only? Is this like a disappearance of track two? Is that, what would you say to that reading? I'm being a little bit like provocative here, but
Yeah.
I want to see your perspective on this.
fascinating question. Thank you. I don't think there's a backlash of track 2 diplomacy at all. But in a sense, there's also a new realism in terms of the question, where can you do track 2 diplomacy and what would you want to achieve? And as I said, maybe this is due to the fact that Germany, was undergoing a time we could call, or in Germany, we would call denazification after World War II. Culture, science, higher education were highly decentralized. Not only that, but also put on the highest levels of freedom and self-definition, so to speak. So the state could actually fund, and give maybe a framework of what it wants, but ultimately, it lies at the science's interest to do whatever it wants to do, to go wherever it wants to go, and to collaborate with whoever, and apart from, the problem of controlling, thousands, tens of thousands of people just within one university, there was never the possibility actually to say, okay, you should not do that, and we stop the funding, especially due to the fact that there is a large degree of basic funding, for universities. Nowadays, things have changed. So if we talk about federal funded money, at least, that is coming from the German Bundestag and that is going through ministries or project funding agencies to higher education and science, there is a new realism saying that, do you really want to go there? Should you really take the risk of going there? Or in some radical cases, stopping earmarked funds completely, at the same time not allowing people from anywhere in the world to enter research premises in Germany. It's somehow, it relates to nudging. So the state does not forbid research organizations to do things, but it still has third-party money that it could delegate towards things, and it could actually increase, I wouldn't say pressure, but an awareness among the research community and the research funding and performing organizations that there are ethical concerns. So this is the official side. The unofficial side, and that's something which is almost confidential, but I'm not in Parliament anymore, is that 1/3 of Chinese applications, to enter the German research system are actually turned down at the embassy. You don't get visa anymore because you have identified the origin of institution where people come from. There's the so-called 7 Sons of Defense. So there's a couple of universities that are directly linked to the Chinese army. And so, I mean, people are not stupid. They know, how to deal with it. But that is some sort of track 2 diplomacy, trying to find out where it comes from and what threat it would actually mean to the German science, technology, and innovation system. So maybe this is the answer: raising awareness on one hand, that science cannot actually stand aside of societal challenges, right, including security, and cannot go naively wherever it wants to go because it's just science or higher education, and an increase in security measures. Yeah.
All right, perfect. So we have another question. So what could you recommend to scientists who are just getting started to try to communicate their recommendations to decision makers? What's a good place to start? What are the do's and don'ts, for young scientists?
Huh. I would start asking myself if I can really offer something, or if I would just want to, enter the bubble of social media and, feel important, although I'm not. That's a white hair recommendation of a person who's 45 years old now. The second one, I was just joking, but the second one is, am I asked, actually? So it's very hard to approach, decision makers in politics and say, I'm so knowledgeable and I have things for you you've never known before, right? That's not a wise decision. The third one is gather intelligence. So a single person is a single person, and it's very hard to find, the ears of people. But gather, intelligence together and institutionalize it. Use the recommendation of institutions, and do not stumble across politics alone. That is one thing. The fourth one is think about the consequences of your recommendations, right? So I have done a study on SDI espionage in 2018. I put it on one of these dumb shit sites, academia.edu. A couple of years later, my study was used by our right-wing extremist party in parliament, saying that this is proof. Obviously, it's not proof because it was just, some pre-study. So whenever something is out in the world, you should be aware that it might enter, into pockets and hallways you don't want it to be. Always be aware of that. Yeah.
It's so interesting. I think your recommendations all sort of fit together because first of all, you need to have your motivations clear. Do you want to just become popular? I mean, what's your reason, your underlying reason, and it should be a really good one. Also, just reinforcing this idea of collaborating, sort of tackling or approaching your networks. I think collective knowledge is easier to be heard of, right? And thinking about the consequences. I think, yeah, that's it's so interesting what you the way you put those recommendations. Let me see what else I have here. All right, let me just go back to another question that I had connected to the first one. So when you were explaining the the new EU framework for science diplomacy, you said they added a fourth dimension, right? Meaning diplomacy in science, and how even the most natural, pure scientific, international scientific collaboration can become political, right? And you just brought to me the idea of the notion of the challenges of achieving equitable partnerships between North and South scientists, which I think not all collaborations are like that, but many are like that. And I think for us, as a a country in the global South, one of our pathways to the global scientific dialogue is by collaborating with northern partners. So in that sense, I was wondering if there is, now going to the other extreme, is international scientific collaboration now all becoming in a way political, So what do you think? Because now I have the other question, like, is it all part of diplomacy?
I think it was always political, without knowing it, or maybe without actors from the science system knowing it, and being aware of it. And, you know, in stable reciprocal relations, it should feel normal. So it's a no-brainer, okay? But what I find problematic is, as I said, when two parties or a couple of parties, you know, collaborate, and when there is some sort of a normative foundation that you could actually openly criticize on a scientific basis, scientific decisions, scientific findings, results, whatever. So when this foundation is actually cracking up, and one party is actually trying to politicize it, and that's what we see in, you know, cooperation with specific countries and regions, that's something different. Or, as I said, there's power asymmetries, money asymmetries. You know, one party can actually pay whatever it wants to pay, and the other one is, as I said, from, don't even say global south, a poor country, you know, or poor institutions. How can we actually guarantee that we can still find decisions that are scientifically robust and that make sense for both parties, so that the power asymmetries I've just mentioned, you know, do not creep into decisions that should remain scientifically robust for both parties. And we see an increase, actually. So there's even quantitative measurements of these, you know, different relations. And that is something one should be aware of at the moment whenever one engages into international collaborations. At the same time, we shouldn't actually be nervous about all these things, you know. When there's, you know, shitty arguments in the room, you can still call them shitty arguments, you know, and you should have broad shoulders, or broad enough shoulders, to stand, you know, attempts or withstand attempts that try to politicize everything that shouldn't be politicized. And so,
Right.
you know, the world has plenty of opportunities for collaborations. There's not only always that unique partner in the world. Choose somebody else, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, you actually make a point of how relevant teaching about all these things is becoming, not only for those researchers interested in, you know, engaging specifically with science diplomacy, but also, you know, for any scientist who wishes to collaborate with partners around the world. It should be important to, you know, notice or make them more aware about this. So there is another question. I would say that's our last question. So do you think we need more science diplomacy shaped by global South actors? You know, considering maybe addressing specifically this imbalance in power or economic relations? What's your take on that?
The short answer is definitely yes. The more elaborate answer might be a bit twisted or so, because I sometimes have the idea that, you know that the narrative of the global South being in a historically and path-dependent, unfavorable condition, you know, because it used to be colonized, you know, by the Western and Northern European and world, maybe the US. Always coming back to that narrative might not bring you further if you want to engage into collaborations and try to find, you know, out of that situation. I know it sounds hard and unfair, but that is part of diplomacy. You know, you have to play it more intelligently. And
Right.
I think one of the big advantages that countries, not everywhere, but certain countries in the global south have vis-a-vis, the northern hemisphere or the highly industrialized countries is talent. And there's so many people, young talents, and we are in a decaying situation. People are getting old here and people are trying to find talent. So don't sell out, but at the same time, try to engage in a more intelligent way. I don't want to sound condescending here, because it sounds very comfortable for me to say it. But whenever you play that, don't get me wrong, that radical leftist idea, and that's a very comfortable situation that students in my seminars always play, yeah, it's so unfair and we need to even out. My realist answer, and I'm provocative, is, okay, how far do you get with that? Can we not try to make it more appealing? Because otherwise people always call you, oh, okay, these are the leftist potheads from Harvard University, being super rich, studying at Harvard and MIT and protesting for the poor in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that is very bizarre sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. I understand. It's very difficult because just saying it from our perspective, sometimes when you're not within that discourse, then your voice doesn't get heard because everyone is used to hearing this type of discourse. So yeah, it is there is definitely a tension there, but I understand. We have so many questions and so little time, so I'm just going to choose one. I don't know if you have access to the chat. You can also let me just read them, and then you can choose if maybe you can maybe sum up a quick answer that addresses in a way what is there, if it's possible. This is just an experiment. So one of the question was, what should be the role of universities in Latin America in strengthening their positioning in science diplomacy? So this is more, of course, related to universities. The other one is more towards scientific communication. How does scientific communication support science diplomacy in Latin America? I think that one is broader. It connects to many of the things you have already said. And then let me just read the last one. This one is very it's quite long. Let me see it. It's from Carlos Nopia. So could you give us more information about the spirit of creating a new dimension of science diplomacy in the European version, while the American British is a reducing or reductive one? It is interesting to understand this logic, taking into account that a new protagonist, at least in the new revision, is a more active civil society. This new active actor would make more complex the dimensions. What do you think? So again, addressing this, like increasing or decreasing the science diplomacy dimensions. I know this is a lot. I think there's one that is broader, the other one more university related. Just what do you think? Final reflections.
Well, first one, what should be the role of universities in Latin America in strengthening their position in science diplomacy? Good one. I'm not competent. My gut feeling is try to play both. So play the international angle, that is increase your cooperation, your collaborative ties with other countries. But that's, I'm always so humble to say something that I'm very proud to see, especially with, actors like the DAAD. So it's very nice actually to see this is actually flourishing. The other one is definitely show these increased international dimensions and ties to your home governments and put, increase pressures on them to invest into science, technology, higher education. But as I said, I would need intelligence and input. It's just a gut feeling and my impression. So the spirit of the new dimension of science diplomacy in the European version, while the US and British is reducing one. Yeah, I mean, Trump is in government, you know. We had a populist government by Boris Johnson in the UK, and now they're trying to give away, you know, or reducing and pulling, you know, the very realist string. That is, if it's not in our interest, you know, we are not interested. The European is trying to come up with a counter narrative, so to speak, and saying, you know, yes, we know science is more important than ever. And we know it's not only important, you know, for the sake of greasing the wheel of you know, having peaceful international orders, but it's also more important in terms of, as I said, economic and innovative capacity building. And in this regard, it's so intelligent or so more intelligent to train researchers, research managers, people who work in higher education, to be diplomatic actors and to strengthen their ties with, you know, whoever in the world, because this is, you know, the forefront of prosperity. And at the same time, they need to be more aware of, as I said, the security angles of their actions. So this is basically the big gulf. You have a new realist government or a very strange government in the US, and you had Boris Johnson in the UK. You know, Brexit is one thing. Reducing that angle, and ours is actually increasing. So that maybe is the difference. Yeah,
totally. That's I think the perfect reflection of how academia and scholarly outputs are also a reflection of a much wider picture, including socio-economical dynamics. Well, Dr. Flink, it's been really a pleasure and an honor. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all the presentation you have, for the presentation you gave us today. Thank you to all of you for your interest and your active participation. Soon you will be able also to find the videos of the 3 sessions on the DAAD YouTube channel, the DAAD Colombia. And of course, we look forward to the upcoming activities and events organized by the MEDIC, but by DAAD, and to continuing our exchange with all of you on topics related to science diplomacy. Dr. Flink, I hope you can visit us soon in Colombia. It would be such a pleasure to have you. I hope maybe your new job brings you or have you interested in our region and our country. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much from my part. Thanks a lot. I hope it's not the professional business that brings me to Colombia, but maybe, you know, as a passionate science diplomat, we could actually intensify these discussions.
Awesome.
And yeah, I've just posted in the chat, so everyone who likes to do so, feel free to contact me via LinkedIn. I think there's only one Tim Flink on LinkedIn. So I'm happy to, you know, continue this conversation. And whoever is coming to Berlin, just give me, you know, drop me a line and we meet for coffee.
Wonderful.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Have a nice day.
Yeah,
Cheers,
you have
goodbye.
a good evening. Bye. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.